Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation on what is now a proposed federal policy change related to the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act, by all accounts, a landmark piece of bipartisan legislation. I am Ellie Dehoney. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Research America. Thanks so much for joining us. For those of you who may not be familiar with Research America, we're a cross-sector alliance, patient organizations, research universities, independent research institutes, industry. We have philanthropies. We've really try to cross the whole ecosystem, and we're committed to, I think, what is a common thread for all of us, is we want to ensure our nation contributes ever more meaningfully to scientific, medical, and also public health progress. So if your organization is not a Research Alliance member, here is my big pitch. If you wouldn't mind connecting with Joel Nepomuceno, I believe his contact information is in the chat, or should be, to learn more about our alliance, and do join us. We're stronger for every new member who does. So I hope you'll consider it. And just a bit of housekeeping as we begin today's discussion. If you wouldn't mind engaging, we'd love engagement during this discussion. And I think there are two options: typing the questions into the chat or into the Q&A box, whichever you prefer, and we'll get to as many as we can. And so I'd love to introduce our special guests today: Dr. John Hamre, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense and current President and CEO at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Many of us know that as CSIS. And that's just really scratching the surface of his many, many distinctions. And similarly, Capitol Hill veteran and health policy expert Paul Kim. And I've known Paul for years, and it would take all of this hour to talk about the many wonderful things about Paul. But we're going to be talking about this law and a proposed potential change in federal policy that jeopardizes its future impact. So I think, Paul, you've agreed to kick things off. So let me turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellie. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this important and timely discussion. Jacqueline, can we go to the second slide? Great. So let's begin with what technology transfer means. Broadly, it means commercialization, advancing novel technologies, product innovations, manufacturing processes, platform inventions, all of them into the marketplace from the lab bench. But critically, that commercialization, as you can see in this graphic, requires partnerships, a bridge from the public sector to the private sector to convey intellectual property, the ownership and the rights to those inventions that were discovered through federally funded R&D. Today, the legal baseline is that that IP belongs to the inventor, even though their discovery was enabled by federal dollars. This policy has its roots way back in Vannevar Bush's landmark report to FDR, Science: The Endless Frontier, the literal Old Testament of post-war R&D policy. So let me just quote a sentence from that 1945 report. When a patent is granted on research, which has been sponsored by government in whole or in part, the ownership of the patent remains with the inventor, and the government receives, in addition to a royalty-free license, the power to require the licensing of others. Let's remember these little pieces of nuggets of wisdom, because they actually underlie the conversation today and the changes that Ellie referred to. Most importantly, that vision from the Vannevar Bush report is the foundation for this dynamic cycle of technology transfer that drives the innovation economy. It created what my former boss, the late Senator Kennedy, called the century of life sciences. And next slide, please, Jacqueline. But this wasn't always the case. Before 1980, technology transfer resulting from these billions of federal R&D dollars invested annually at universities and federal labs was stymied by inconsistent, incoherent policies, agency by agency, sector to sector. At the bottom there, you see a quote from Senator Bayh, one of the authors of Bayh-Dole. He argued that in developing this current law, this logjam was crippling our national ROI on our critical R&D investments. Next slide, please, Jacqueline. So the Bayh-Dole Act literally flipped this script. It transferred title from the federal government presumptively to the inventors, and the legal expectation of those inventors and or their licensee partners was timely, practical application, i.e. commercialization. As a condition of this largesse, to protect the public fisc and interest, the federal government retains rights, as you see in the red box, a license to practice for itself and use the IP for itself, a right to keep IP under exceptional circumstances, and key to our conversation today, march-in rights, when the IP holder is not living up to this grand bargain. It's striking how current law under Bayh-Dole Act, as described here, embodies that paradigm from 1945. Next slide, please. So let's take a quick and hopefully painless detour into the language of the law itself. This is 35 U.S.C. 200, as you can see, the very first section of Bayh-Dole as enacted in 1980. It's very clear here that Congress's legislative intent was to enact this grand bargain, enable U.S.-based nonprofits, universities, and small businesses to invent and market new products and services while, in red, reserving certain rights to the government to assure commercialization takes place as it was intended. Just note here in the black letter of the policy and objectives of the Bayh-Dole Act that Congress was not talking about pricing. It was talking about the application and enablement of inventions, about product development and commercialization. Next slide, please. So for decades, the bipartisan consensus has been that the Bayh-Dole Act has successfully stimulated and transformed our innovation economy. Here, we should take special note of Dr. Atkinson's assessment in the blue box, because he was there at the birthing of the law itself at the helm of the National Science Foundation when President Carter signed the bill into law. Next slide, please, Jacqueline. So in addition to those glowing qualitative assessments, the numbers also speak for themselves. These figures are from 1996 to 2020 and come from university tech transfer professionals. So this does not include tech transfer to small businesses, which was estimated at around 15% of total federal tech transfer a few years ago. So we can round these numbers up. A separate study from this August also found that patents under Bayh-Dole, and I'll quote, represent a larger share in select emerging technology categories, AI, robotics, biotechnology, than in the overall U.S. patent landscape. So what that means is the law figures very prominently in these critical fields, these critical competitive fields. Let me also just add, from a personal perspective from the life sciences where I've spent my career, these figures capture the indispensable role that the law has played in the emergence and global dominance of the U.S. biotechnology industry. So next slide, please. What is changing? And the focus of our discussion is a sudden pivot in federal implementation of Bayh-Dole. Now, the fulcrum point of this pivot is, as we see here, march-in rights. Let's take this second final, I promise, detour into the letter of the law. As we've talked about, Bayh-Dole says that inventors take title to the IP of their inventions, which are spawned from federally funded R&D. Now, here in this section, the government retains rights to march-in, which is expressed in blue, but only under highly limited circumstances, 4 to be precise. And we want to focus on the first 2 in red because of the government's recent focus on pricing. Now, under A1 is when the IP holder doesn't hold up its side of the Bayh-Dole bargain. They fail to achieve, as you see in the language, practical application of the invention. A2 is when the government has to step in to alleviate health or safety needs. Now, note the box at the bottom. This is critical. In more than 40 years, the federal government has never marched in under any of these criteria. So to me, that strongly suggests 2 things. One is that the innovation enterprise, federal R&D funding, tech transfer, commercialization, that water wheel of innovation that we saw on that first slide, that enterprise is working exceptionally well. And 2, the federal government has understood for decades that the march-in right itself, as written here, was written narrowly. It must be exceptionally circumscribed and narrow in focus, not to have been triggered after so many decades on the books. Next slide, please. So the pivot in federal thinking, the change in federal thinking has happened since 2019. That year, NIST issued a white paper that reflected the 40-year consensus, margin risks creating uncertainties that would drag down innovation. That 2 years later, in 2021, NIST began rulemaking to amend Bayh-Dole's implementing regulations. Now, in that proposed rule, they specifically said that product pricing should not be the basis of margin. Next slide, please, Jacqueline.
Uh-oh, it looks like we may have lost Paul. Paul, are you still with us? If not, I can take over temporarily in a very, very shadowy second place to Paul. So there's been kind of a sea change in federal policy. So there was a call for federal agencies to get together and reevaluate the use of margin. And because of that, there has been a change in there's been a proposed framework for the use of the margin provisions of Bayh-Dole that envisions and actually would require federal agencies. And thank goodness Paul's coming
Wow,
back.
guys, I apologize. My computer crashed.
Well, I was riffing kind of like a jazz singer does
Oh my God.
without much success while you were
I'm so
calling Paul.
sorry.
So
Boy, guys, I don't think we're at risk anymore. So yeah, I think we're okay. Let me just push on really quickly.
please
So
do.
we
Yeah.
were talking about the change in thinking from the proposed rule that NIST issued in 2019. Oh my gosh, it says it's running low. So here's the gist of it. The executive order that issued in July 2021 countermanded NIST and told the agency not to do this flat out. And instead, last year, Commerce and HHS said that they would review margin rights. And in July of last year, a second executive order was issued that directed the federal agencies funding R&D to also review when the government can withhold title, remember, exceptional circumstances, from private companies under Bayh-Dole. So taken as a whole, these developments mark the beginning, I think, of a reversal of this 40-year bipartisan consensus of how to administer the act. Next slide, please, Jacqueline. So the capstone to this reversal was in December. NIST issued a request for information, or RFI, on an unprecedented march-in draft interagency guidance framework, which is a mouthful. Let's just call it a draft framework. Now, this is meant to apply to all federal R&D funding agencies across every sector. Comments are due February 6th in just 2 weeks, so many stakeholders, including Research America, have asked for an extension to prepare their submissions and comments. But I believe the docket already has, I think I looked at it, it said something like 39,000 comments. Ellie, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it sounds like it's a very popular topic for comment. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what the draft framework says. Let's click once. Here are the three basic questions that one would ask in whether or not to apply the margin rights. Let's click again. So critically, for the first time, product pricing is proposed as a basis for margin. Click one more time. So here you'll remember the two criteria we talked about in margin. So under these criteria, here are the questions that NIST asks the agencies, or really requires the agencies to ask. Under A1, has the holder of the IP taken effective steps to achieve application? So the questions are, what's the price? Is the price too high for many consumers? What is the cost basis and justification for the price? A new line of inquiry, totally de novo. Let's go to A2. Next, click one more time. Under that second criteria, the health and safety, the agency has narrower questions. Is the price extreme or unjustified? Does it put people at risk? Is it exploitive? So you can see at first blush that these are more narrowly tailored than A1. But thankfully, this is not the end of NIST's inquiry, its flowchart, if you will, under the draft framework. Please click one last time, Jack. The draft framework also asks agencies to balance whether margin would impact innovation. So in other words, would margin serve the legislative intent of the Bayh-Dole Act? Again, something that no agency has ever done and ever reached an affirmative conclusion on. Also, the draft framework says, well, if a product is protected by patents not in the scope of Bayh-Dole, then it's less likely that margin can be exercised. And by the way, this is something quite common in my neck of the woods, biopharmaceuticals and medical technology. Next slide, please. And these are our last two slides. So we've discussed the history and the changing landscape for Bayh-Dole. And I think as a consequence, we have grounds now to assess the draft framework and its inclusion of unreasonable pricing for March-in against the historic record of implementation, those 40 plus years of policy and adjudications that preceded it. Now, in the first bullet, we know that before the law was enacted, GAO found that federal agencies didn't use March-in, or some of them didn't think it was needed, which is significant, I think, when you think about it in terms of the legislative intent. In 1989, second bullet, NIH adopted a very familiar sounding reasonable pricing clause for its cooperative agreements under Bayh-Dole after controversy over the pricing of the first drug against AIDS, AZT, which was developed with federal funds. But 6 years later, NIH dropped the clause under, I would note, a Democratic administration because the clause could not be reconciled with the agency's principal duties under Bayh-Dole, as you can see. In the third bullet, this is significant in my eyes as a former staffer, the authors of the law themselves are on public record as deliberately omitting pricing from March-in. Congress's legislative intent should carry weight, especially if there's a judicial challenge to the draft framework or an agency's use of it, and if the Supreme Court repudiates the Chevron doctrine this year, which is widely expected. And sorry, I'm a recovering lawyer. Let me get in the weeds for a second. One possible doctrinal replacement for Chevron would be where the courts would follow agency interpretations, but only to the extent that they are persuasive and consistent with earlier agency interpretations. So you can imagine how the draft framework might fare in a post-Chevron world. The fourth bullet, let's not forget, of course, that NIST itself proposed just a few years ago the opposite policy regarding pricing. And finally, in the last bullet, as recently as last year, NIH has ruled consistently against multiple public petitions to March-in on prescription drugs developed with federal IP based on their prices. So you remember that A1 March-in criterion, not taking effective steps to achieve practical application. In each of its adjudications, NIH concluded that practical application was evidenced by the fact that a prescription drug had been commercialized and marketed, period. So time and again, in administrations of both flavors, the agency has found no basis on the law to intervene, and that could change under the draft framework, which could make NIH responsible for effectively regulating prescription drug pricing. Last slide. Thanks, Jacqueline. So here we see just some of the reactions to date. I haven't plumbed the docket to the draft framework from inventors, colleges, universities, medical schools, private companies, investors, and trade associations, all the stakeholders that populate our innovation economy. And I think, this gives you a good sense of the reserve and concerns that have already been expressed. So thank you very much. That was the overview. I'm very eager to hear from Dr. Hamre, whose very distinguished career has spanned much of what we've already talked about. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Ellie.
That was just terrific, Paul. And there's a really a compelling question from Hans in the chat. We'll hold that, Hans, if you don't mind, because I do want to get John's reflections on, this situation and what it means for the American economy, innovation, and societal progress, medical progress, and other progress that lasts through the ages, really. So, John, over to you.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. I apologize. I'm not a patent attorney. I'm not a legal expert. So this is territory that's really much beyond my background. I'm a defense guy, okay, and so I'm going to offer just a few words in that regard. A lot of what I've learned about Bayh-Dole and March-in rights, I've learned through, we have a program here at CSIS called Renewing American Innovation. And I've spent some time trying to study it, but I'm no expert. So I'm speaking on this really as a defense guy. And I do think it's a national security issue. And let me explain why. When I talk with people about national security, I always say there's two national securities: national security with a capital N, capital S, and national security with a small n, small s. Okay. Now the small n, small s national security, that's things like aircraft carriers, missiles, bombers, tanks, army divisions, all the stuff that's, that we buy for the Defense Department so they can go to war. That's national security with small case NS. The other national security, capital N, capital S, that's is far more important. That national security is about the health of your economy, the dynamism of your ideas industry, the competence and energy in your private sector, especially the business world, the sense of fairness and cohesiveness in your society, the trust in the judicial system for fair, honest, equal access to the law and execution of the law. That's national security, capital N, capital S. And it is by far more important than is small n, small s national security. The most important decision we made to win the Cold War was actually a decision we made 25 years before it started. And that was when we made a decision that we were going to buy aircraft for the military from the private sector and not make them in military arsenals. At that time, everything we made was from arsenals, and we had all of the inefficiencies and all of the costs, with arsenals. That we knew that the private sector was going to give us, would keep us dynamic and current. And, to win the Cold War, it wasn't about military competition, really. It was an economic competition. But we had to counter the massive Soviet army that was still occupying Europe. We had to do that with qualitative advantage. And so we did that by relying on the private sector to give us these new technologies and new ideas, new concepts. And this is, Mr. Kim mentioned Vannevar Bush and the Endless Frontiers Act. That really was foundational to the success of the Cold War, and it is now the foundation for what this great competition that we're in with China. So we fundamentally, for national security, depend on the creativity and the energy in our private sector. That's really where we get our ideas that we bring into the Defense Department, but more importantly, it is the foundation of the real foundation of national security, the vitality of our economy. So it's the reason that I'm intensely interested in renewing American innovation. We're in a great competition with China at this stage. I'm not paranoid about this, but China has some real advantages. They pursue what's called state capitalism. First of all, they have a market that has about 1.4 billion consumers, so they've got 4 times the market that we do. Their state-owned enterprises don't have to make a profit. They get preferential financing from the government. So there's no cost of capital formula that matters in China. The government steals intellectual property secrets for them, and the government weaponizes access to their own economy, for political purposes. So we're in a real competition. Now, we don't believe in state competition. Capitalism, excuse me. We believe in a free market. And here it's the role of the government to ensure a level and fair playing field for economic actors. And to ensure that there are guardrails in place, both to protect consumers as well as competitors. The government plays a role as an umpire, to make sure the game is played fairly. But there is an important thing that we have done for 50, 70 years, really from Vannevar Bush on, and that is provide structural incentives to invent new ideas. We don't we don't give those ideas exclusively to one company or another. We let the marketplace decide what is going to be advanced. But we put that, it's the government's responsibility to create innovation in America through these incentives. And Bayh-Dole is fundamentally one of those key tools we have to support an innovation economy for this great national security competition. Now, what my concern about this latest attack on Bayh-Dole, I mean, it's narrowly defined as being, about pricing for drugs, but that's not really what it is. It's really an attack on the basic philosophy. Can the private sector benefit from an idea that was invented in part with government funding? That's really what's at stake. And that's really what's the agenda of the opponents to Bayh-Dole, opponents that want to use march-in rights. It's an effort to reverse a decision we made over 40 years ago, to boost innovation by allowing the private sector to take advantage of ideas that have been created. The government wanted that, and it's been hugely beneficial and very important for us in national security. Now that's capital N, capitalist, but it's also important national security, small n, small s, because over the last years, I'm sorry, I have to turn this off. Over the last years, there's been a shift. 40 years ago, the Department of Defense invested in R&D, and it ended up in weapon systems. Now, overwhelmingly, we're bringing in ideas in the private sector into the government. There's been an inversion, and so anything that deteriorates the innovation culture in America is a direct threat to our national security, both capital NS and small letter NS national security. So I think this ought to be seen as a much larger, much more dangerous development. I don't understand the administration's view, because I think it's opening a terrible, terrible direction that could undermine lots of things in the country, not the least of which is our national security. Let me stop there.
I think that so much resonated, and an aspect of that I think of on the ground are states like Oklahoma and Georgia, who have fostered a startup culture where it doesn't stop with academia. Then there are small businesses, and then there are the businesses that support the small businesses. And so it blossoms the economy and makes use of ingenuity and innovation to help from kind of the ground up, from the small business to the large business to a thriving, diversified economy. So really, thank you very much. And of course, in the script are all the questions I'm supposed to ask. But what I'm going to do instead is start with questions that are in the chat, since I can't remember where my script is in my Word docs. So, let's start with Hans. I think he had the first question in the chat, Paul.
Oh, I see it. Yes.
Did you see that? Does the guidance make reference to these past agencies' decisions and rationale?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. If you look at the RFI and the guidance, the draft framework itself, it doesn't reference the things that we were just talking about, the history underlying the way that the act has been implemented, and why agencies like NIH have decided not to exercise march-in, notwithstanding this whole set of questions that NIST is asking the agencies to undertake now, formally, consistently, and uniformly, any time that there's a question about a technology that's been licensed out and whether or not it's actually subject to march-in. So the short answer is, are those past decisions precedent? I think if the draft framework is adopted, probably not, because what we've now seen is NIST is going to tell all the agencies, this is the way you should be deciding things from day zero on. And so I think they could be decided substantially differently based upon the guidance. I think that even the proposition that this is possible automatically creates this tremendous uncertainty, doesn't it? Because we've relied upon what we know, what we've experienced, what we've seen in terms of decision making. And now, to your question, we're being asked to start on a totally new sheet of paper.
That's a great answer. Another, and I guess you did kind of answer Amber's question too at the same time. There is a point, John, that you made. We, by hook or by crook, have developed a prosperous economy that grows jobs and builds jobs, and I know we've had our problems there, but our economy benefits. We try to ensure it also benefits the global community. So we need more ingenuity and more of this work in areas like neglected tropical diseases. And all of this is tied back into technology transfer and the fact that a public good, non-commercial research or green energy, right? The fact that taxpayers help fund non-commercial research typically. I mean, not typically, that's the goal. Just kind of the fundamental research, the ingenuity, the thinking that builds knowledge, that provides this foundation for an economy that really has thrived. And so I think we all should be worried about a law that not only the letter of the law and the congressional intent of both of its authors says, we don't envision research agencies adjudicating drug prices. We envision them funding research. But the fact that it shoots an arrow into our economy at a time where we're facing increased global competition. I think you mentioned this. China, I'm wondering I think China's one country. There are others that have very robust industries growing in our areas, and we want to compete fairly. We don't necessarily want our IP out there through compulsory licensing, right? Is there any risk in that regard, John, with tech transfer being kind of rescinded in a sense?
Well, I think it gets to the broader underlying agenda of the people who are raising this march-in thing. And that is, their real goal is to reverse Bayh-Dole at its starting point. And its starting point was, should the government give any commercial rights to anybody else when it put money on the table? I mean, that's really what the story was about. Now, prior to Bayh-Dole, very, very little technical innovation that the government funded ever found its way to the marketplace because there were no incentives.
Yeah.
It just never got to the marketplace. There were no incentives. And so the beauty of Bayh-Dole was that it created, it married doing well and doing good at the same time. And so even though the people who are making this battle, and I think the administration has a fairly narrow view of it, but I think they're wrong. They have a narrow view of it, that this is just about drug prices. It isn't about drug prices. It is about a fundamental issue, is that when ideas are invented in part with provenance, provided part of the provenance traces back to government funding, can the government come in at any time and make them give it away to anybody else? And that's what's at risk. This is who would benefit from this in the semiconductor industry more than China?
Right.
I mean, this makes no sense to
Right,
force
if we're containing our innovation, basically.
It's just basically you're eviscerating one of the foundational elements of our innovation system. And we've already had, in my view, an unfortunate weakening of property rights through some things that have been done in the patent law over the last several years. This would be really crippling, because it really is fundamentally a different worldview by the people who are pushing this march-in thing. They want to reverse a decision that was made 40 years ago. That's really what it is. And I don't, at a time when now the Defense Department depends far more on what's being invented in the private sector than what they fund, nobody in the private sector is going to want to have any dealings with DoD because it would taint their ideas. It
You know, it's a
potentially
good point.
compromises their ideas. It potentially makes their ideas, because of we fund individual research, independent research inside corporations. They get to write it off on some contracts, et cetera. None of them are going to want to do anything with the federal government because they put at risk the ideas that they've invented.
And that's happened before, Paul, I think you mentioned in your slides. And it also brings up one more point, is that I think there may be sometimes an overestimation or the proportions of investment is misunderstood. So I think there's recent research that says about 1 to 1.5% of any, I believe this is in the life science arena of any invention that makes it to the market, about 1.15%. If there was federal funding, that's what it represents.
Yeah.
But Paul, you know, I'm sorry.
No, I think you're exactly right. In fact, there was a GAO report, I think from 2003. They looked at, does the federal government use the exclusive license it has under BIDOL, not the marching rights, but the exclusive license. And it found that, for example, the federal government, like NIH, uses it for research, but procuring agencies like, CMS or the VA or Department of Defense, Dr. Hamre, they don't use the exclusive license to acquire, or manufacture medicines or products because, as Dr. Hamre said, it is so much more efficient to use conventional contracting and all the authorities they have in other bodies of federal law to do it. So, and I think this gets to the question that Amber raised, which is, this imposes new responsibilities, not only on NIST and Department of Commerce, but every agency under the sun that does tech transfer. And to add those responsibilities at a time, which John, I think you've mentioned, you already have mission critical, challenging, responsibilities, to add on the fact that you're going to have to be policing BIDOL, which already has reporting requirements, under a fact pattern that hasn't established that there's a problem. I think that's really questionable. And I think those are legitimate questions to bring to the agency in comment to the draft.
One thing I'd like to raise, it's a question about that Corinne raised in our chat. And I think it goes to something that I'd really think is important to say from Research America's perspective. Affordability is critical. It's a health in the health world, it's a health systems issue. We're spending a lot of money in every area of healthcare and they are interdependent, right? So if you kind of hyper in on anything, let's say you only talked about hospitalizations, what's that going to do with the whole system? If you only talk about prescription drugs, then what is that going to do to the amount of physician care and hospital care and others? It's really, really complicated. So I do want to go to Corinne's question just for a moment. I don't know the answer to it. And Paul and John, you may, but is there any economic evidence that price could be better contained through modifications on the discovery end of the pipeline, innovation pipeline, compared to the payer end?
Yeah,
we talked about this a little bit.
I think if you take the data that we saw on that splash page about the things that have happened since 1980 as a result of federal tech transfer across sectors, flip it, because that's what would happen if you had inhibited the mouth, if you'd squeezed the mouth of the funnel shut for whatever reasons. Let's say because you're scaring people that you may use marching at some point 10 years down the stream. So I think it's fair to say that that is indirect evidence that would be what's at risk if you actually start doing, as Corinne said, squeezing the pipeline at the front. And I will say that in terms of addressing a perceived need for pricing, this is the question I think that Tim said in reference to insulin, for example. I think somebody else asked about whether or not, there are other ways to do this. Of course, there are many more efficient ways of doing this. Let's just take, for example, Medicare and Medicaid, where beneficiaries have a statutory right to certain types of benefits and coverage of medical products. And so that's why Congress has enacted things like the Medicare drug price negotiation program, the outpatient drug rebates, the best price rebates for Medicaid. So those are much more finely tuned, better calibrated, more efficient policies that go directly to the problem of price, without, I think, as somebody said in the question, squeezing the mouth of the funnel. And really at that point, I think it's a question of, if it ain't broke, why are you trying to fix it?
Yeah, I will just moderate that a little bit, and that I do think there are well-intentioned. I actually think that those pieces of legislation, again, don't recognize the systemic issue of affordability. So there are some issues with the drugs that the laws that you just mentioned also. That doesn't mean that they don't have some really great provisions, but I wouldn't say from Research America's perspective,
Sure.
we've found the golden ticket to affordability for healthcare. So any thoughts regarding the push for this change at Paul, this is over my head.
Oh, I think, Dr. Hamre, this is about DCSA.
I looked at it. I wasn't exactly sure I understood the question. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. We may have to get back to you on that one. Hopefully, if you wouldn't mind sharing your email address with Joel, whose email address is above, or I can certainly, my my information is in my address block. We'll get an answer to you on that.
I don't know quite how to answer it.
Yeah, I do think David's point is well taken. The tech transfer laws don't typically hit the end products, and the prices of end products are not the prices of end products. They're the list prices, and then there's all sorts of machinations around them. So the idea of the federal government, or for NIH, for example, having to track what's the margin, what's the PBM discount, how much of that PBM discount is reasonable, there's a lot of complication to this. I also think it's really important to go back to the fact that the letter of the law and the congressional intent of the law doesn't envision pricing.
Well, but if I could just, generally we don't think it's a good idea for the government to dictate prices in America. I mean, invariably when you get non-market distortions like that, you warp the market, and you may create an artificial demand, you may suppress a legitimate demand. I mean, the government isn't any good at setting prices. So this is a political response to, there's a real issue about affordability of drugs for a lot of people in America. That's a real issue.
Sure.
But this isn't the way to solve it. The way to solve it is to find a way where we have better allocation of resources to poor people so they have access to healthcare. My life depends on a very expensive drug, a drug that was actually invented through a buy-dole transfer thing. I can afford it. Not many people can. And we should deal with that. But you don't deal with it by undermining the foundation of how we design our economy.
Right. A very wise person said to me, we need to get people of good faith together from across economic sectors, patients and others, and on the healthcare issue, and work together. Everyone's going to have some skin in the game, and also it's going to hurt for everybody, but work together to figure this out. And Amber, you have an interesting question here. In other words, I think what you're saying, are there actually legitimate reasons to use margin, and it's actually been lobbying that has prevented margins? If I'm reading that question right. Am I reading that question right, Paul and John?
Yeah, I mean, let's take, I think as far as a good precedent for the draft framework was the NIH reasonable pricing clause in its CRADAs. There were 6 or 7 adjudications of margin petitions.
CRADAs are a contract mechanism that NIH can also use, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. But
industry.
under Bayh-Dole, this was a mechanism for tech transfer. And so March-in did apply. But we would have to be extremely skeptical to believe that across bipartisan administrations over the past 30 years, that each and every time, corporate influences managed to influence the National Institutes of Health, which is very much a health science R&D based agency, they typically don't get lobbied about anything, unlike, say, CMS.
Right.
That each of those instances were really the result of corporate influence or lobbying or something other than the agency's career scientists and lawyers reading the law, looking at precedent, understanding congressional intent, and reading the criteria from March-in. So I think they probably read it as there isn't a problem, but not in terms of high drug prices, but a problem insofar as March-in can be exercised. Has a contractor failed to take those effective steps to apply the invention? Or is there a health or safety need which is not reasonably satisfied the contractor? And again, NIH concluded, look, they took a molecule from concept to bedside, spent, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever to develop that drug with federal contributions at the front end. And Hans' question gets this, Hans' next question. But the NIH concluded the fact that the drug was marketed, got FDA approval, constitutes not only effective steps to application, but they're addressing health or safety needs by offering the drug for market. So it's hard for me to be that cynical about how NIH reached its decisions in each and every one of those examples.
And I'd also, having been on both sides of this issue when I was working in Congress, the lobbying for March-in has been incredibly intense by well-intentioned folks at Public Citizen and other. There has been a ton of pressure on the other side to actually utilize March-in for the purposes of pricing. So, it's not a one-sided kind of a lobbying effort. I am missing one. I see one new message.
While we talk about it, I just wanted to comment on something, John, that you said about, how this was right at the height of the Cold War and helped enable the national enterprise, the defense enterprise to win the Cold War effectively. And, it's the use of rhetoric like that in the life sciences, cancer moonshot, the war on cancer, where we talk about these big swings at public health problems. We're trying to mobilize interest and concern, resources, at a national level in a similar way, right, to national defense, small n, small d. I think that's not an accident, not just because we want to adopt, the successes from national defense, but because people understand the scale and scope of the problems are commensurate and need these kinds of, as you said, small n, small s solution sets.
But the real competition with China is capital N, capital S. And that's the vitality of our economy. That's the creativity.
Yeah.
It's the innovation economy that we have. And you're putting that at risk with this over a very narrow issue.
John, we have the benefit of you here generally, and for Research America, that's such a privilege, and your perspective on international competition and science and technology. I don't want this to be leading at all, but one of our contentions at Research America is that our science and technology ecosystem is very important to our global economic competitiveness and our just the kind of the infrastructure we have on the ground to continue and compete over time. What are your thoughts there? Do you feel like there are other elements of the economy that overwhelm science and technology? This is a risky question, but I want to get your real thoughts on that.
I think we're in a giant competition with China. China has identified technology dominance as the key to its future. And it's going to do that using tools that we cannot use. We're not going to We're not going to create state-owned enterprises and give them preferential financing. We're not going to weaponize our market the way that China has. I mean, so we cannot. We are in a competition that's primarily a technology competition with China that'll dictate kind of where things go over the next 30 years. And it is the fundamental competition. Yes, we worry about, the things like numbers of ships and stuff like that, but it's really an economic and a technology competition. And at the core, our strategy is to be more dynamic and more innovative as a society. We rely on an open marketplace, and the government is not going to pick winners and losers. The market's going to do that. But the government does have an interest in our economy prospering, and the foundation of that is with technology. So it's just as fundamental as it could be for our future. Now, if there are other issues that are very important, I think medical care for poor people is extremely important. I really do. But I don't think you do that at the expense of the foundations of your innovation society.
I think that somehow we need to do both. And the fact is that medical progress builds on itself and is enduring for societies ahead of us.
Yeah.
And I think that's another, I'll add into one of the NDs, and maybe there's a little teeny third one in my view, and that is that diseases are terrorists. They are as vicious as any army that we face. And when you think about Alzheimer's, you think about cancer, you think about rare diseases, you think about MS, you think about lupus. We got to get at them. And, to the extent this policy is really saying medical progress can slow down, technological progress can slow down, not to worry. Yeah, we got to worry. I'd love to ask, I need a few minutes of everybody's time on this for follow-up steps on this issue, but I'd love to ask Paul and John, are there any final comments that you would like to make before we move to the what next phase? You've both been so amazingly
I just to say, I mean, it is fundamentally your national security is your national competitiveness. And we have chosen a path of innovation in our society. The Europeans have chosen a path of government regulation, not innovation. And I think it's caused a huge benefit. I mean, the average per capita income of Germans today is equivalent to Alabama. Okay, it is. So this is what a focus only on regulation is going to do. Focusing on innovation is going to make sure that we can compete effectively and that we can advance the economic foundations for our society. I just hate to think that we're going to put that at risk.
And we're a country, we can do both. We can innovate, and we can
Sure.
make sure that all of the American people, everyone in the United States,
Yep.
is thriving. We have that capacity. We just got to do it. Paul, let me turn to you. Any final thoughts?
I would just say, I think Dr. John has put a very, very important focus on this policy dispute because of the look forward to competitive challenges, now security and economic for our country. And then we talked a little bit about the history of the act and the grand bargain that has worked so well to drive that innovation economy across these sectors in health and in defense. And so this draft framework does appear to be something of a solution in search of a problem. And that problem of high prices for prescription drugs, for example, as I think many of the questioners have pointed out, there are many other more direct, more effective ways to address those issues in the hands of Congress and the federal agencies with current law to address that problem without tinkering with a very well-run engine. And for all the reasons that, John, you've mentioned, how important it is to keep the thing humming.
Excellent. So this is where I ask those of you in the audience to think about taking some action. One of them, and many of you have, and thank you so much, most outside of what Research America has offered in terms of a template. But if you could find it in your busy schedules to submit the first set of comments to NIST and to Commerce, asking for a delay, an extension in the comment period, so more of us can speak up. That would be fabulous. And I'm going to ask Jacqueline or Sam, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat the information we have and the template we have for asking for that extension. Secondly, Research America is putting together comments. I know that's going to shock you, in response to the RFI, and we'll be circulating those in case anyone wants to join us as a signatory if you haven't had time to do your own comments. That's forthcoming. Also, a frequently asked question, thanks to my friend Paul and our great staff. We have frequently asked questions about Bayh-Dole that in kind of in English language to the best of our abilities, and we've answered some of the questions that you all have been asking about this law, its implications, and the framework and its implications. Jacqueline, am I forgetting anything? I think I've already said thank you effusively to John and Paul. You've been so fabulous, as everyone knew you would be. And I really appreciate it. But Jay, is there anything, pop on if there's anything I've forgotten?
I'm taking a look at the script, and you covered it all.
Beautiful, that lovely script that I couldn't find in my Word docs. So listen, and the final thing is to thank the audience. I know we have a large, diverse audience, and we're so grateful to you for joining us during this kind of lunch hour-ish timing. So bye for now. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.